The New Zealand housing market is an absolute disaster. It has, for at least a decade, utterly failed to keep up with demand for new housing, and when cities can't grow up or out, prices can only go one way. Auckland is now more unaffordable than San Francisco, and if you've got one basic rule in urban economics, it's don't have a housing market that's more screwed up than San Francisco's.
When I hear talk about an affordable house, and an affordable house is supposedly $500,000 or $600,000, it's laughable.
Advocates of density try and block sprawl, advocates of sprawl try and block density, and they both succeed in blocking each other.
We have the third biggest new houses in the world, even though I think we have the 20th highest income in the world.
The Reserve Bank has talked a little bit about financial stability implications. I worry about social stability implications.
Over the past few years, house prices keep going up. And for more and more of us, the possibility of ever buying a house becomes less and less realistic. There always seems to be a new villain in this story. Councils, foreign investors, too many migrants, mum and dad investors, the Reserve Bank. The longer I followed this saga, the less I could actually understand what was going on and how things could get better. To help with this, we interviewed 3 housing experts that have studied the New Zealand housing market for decades. With their help, this documentary tries to clear the confusion around the New Zealand housing affordability story, better understand how we got here, and what are some steps we can take to make housing affordable once again.
New Zealand has long had immigration, and for a long time we could cope with that. Our cities were very small, we could easily build new suburbs, and there wasn't much of a problem with that. But over time that became more difficult. People had to move further out. There was more pressure to intensify in the cities, and the people who were already there trying to stifle development where they live. It's a classic NIMBY reaction, not in my backyard. So we had much more lobbying against development as the population started to grow up, and especially in the major cities, and most notably Auckland. And basic supply and demand in economics tells us that if the demand is going up and supply is going up a lot slower, then prices are going to go up.
Foreign buyers were also pointed out to being behind the rise in prices, as they were said to be outbidding locals. In fact, one of the first things the newly elected Labour government did was to ban foreign buyers from buying houses in New Zealand in 2018.
The issue is not who owns the house, the issue is how many houses are there relative to the number of people who want to live in them. The ownership is only a fairly trivial wrinkle on that, and changing the ownership rules, I think, made almost no difference.
Similarly, since COVID-19 kicked in, net migration fell to almost zero. However, during this time, house prices recorded an historic rise.
If you split New Zealand into the 30 biggest towns and cities, there's 12 of them that have had less than 15% population growth over the last 40 years. If you look at these places, there's no population growth, so there's very unlikely to be a supply problem. The houses are already there for people. But in these areas, prices are going up by roughly the same amount as in areas with population growth. And in these areas, there's lots of building taking place, and it's transforming the size of the houses from small houses to big houses. When you're transforming the size of the housing stock all at once, There are definite natural restrictions on how quickly you can transform the housing. And that to me suggests that the supply side of the story may not be the dominant side of the story.
If the number of people within a country or city didn't change, but the wages of those people increased, then house prices could go up as they could afford to pay more. However, if we look at what's happened to wages over time, we don't really see a dramatic increase, or at least not one that meant people were happy to pay multiple times more for a property. Another way people could afford to pay more for a house is through interest rates, as over past decades, interest rates have fallen. How will this affect home buyers? Well, say that you can only pay back $500 each week for a loan and you'd like to take a 30-year mortgage. In the year 2000, the maximum you could borrow would have been $290,000. In 2020, because mortgage rates are lower, the maximum is now more than $400,000. Since the fall in interest rates makes everybody richer all at the same time, everybody can all of a sudden borrow more and more to spend on housing. For some, this will mean actually being able to buy a house. For others, it will mean renovating your home, buying a bigger house, a batch, or an investment property. Let's talk about one last factor that has not changed in the last 20 years, but is believed to be adding fuel to the bonfire in the background. Taxes.
House prices have gone up right around the world since 1990, but they've gone up faster in New Zealand than any other country. We're number one. If they've gone up faster than the rest of the world because of tax issues that are peculiarly New Zealand, most economists would say that house prices are artificially high. New Zealand has a tax system which is fundamentally different than almost all other rich countries. Superficially, it looks the same, but underneath, it's not much the same at all. And it all comes back to the way that we tax income to pay for retirement income. We have the strangest retirement income system in the world. It's different from every other country. We tax general income and we give everybody the same pension once they hit 65. Almost every other country has a special social security tax on labour income. And so you pay tax on your labour income when you're working, which determines how much pension you get. In New Zealand, it's a high pension for low-income New Zealanders, but it's a low pension by world standards for middle-income New Zealanders. So they have to go and save themselves. And then we have the most distortionary tax system in the world towards investing in housing.
To show the difference in what you get, say you put $100K towards your retirement in KiwiSaver. Every year you earn 7% on that investment. However, every April you pay tax on the profit you made that year. If the tax is, say, 25%, after 30 years it'll be over $400,000. If instead you put $100K into the housing market, if your house price increased by 7% each year, because you didn't pay tax for that time, the capital gains you made would balloon to over $660,000.
This means that owner-occupied housing in New Zealand is tax advantaged. And whenever you have a tax advantage asset, you are prepared to pay more for it. And that gives us some of the highest incentives to buy property. So I personally believe that it's impossible to untangle the relative importance. There's a second set of tax issues surrounding landlords. And since 1990, the fraction of the housing stock that's owned by landlords and rented out has been increasing, which sort of means that they've been winning a lot of the auctions. And the reason there is also partially taxed. In New Zealand, if you're a landlord, you pay tax on any rental income minus your costs, but then when you sell the house at the end, there's no additional tax from capital gains. And it's the capital gains taxes which give landlords an incentive to go into landlording rather than other classes of investments because the returns are better. And a capital gains tax would have been a great solution to this had it been introduced, like it had been in most other countries, from 1990 or 2000 when the big property appreciation went up. So this is one case where the horse may have bolted, and attempts to introduce a capital gains tax now may actually lead to an inadvertent side effect for the next 10 years if property prices actually were to fall over the next 10 years, that the government would have to give big capital rebates to people who may have lost money.
This brings us to the other side of the story, supply of housing in New Zealand.